The painting was already gone by the time anyone came looking for it. Nora had processed it on a Tuesday, logged it against the intake manifest, found no matching consignee in the gallery's active records, and sent it back through the freight carrier the following Thursday morning. She had done this correctly. She had done this exactly as the protocol required. The crate was mislabeled, the consignment number was 11 months expired, and the gallery's private custody agreement for that particular piece had lapsed without renewal. Her supervisor, Cale, had been CC'd on the outgoing notification. He had not responded. So the crate left. She was sitting at the intake desk on the 3rd floor when Edouard's man arrived. His name was Dimi, though she did not know that yet. She knew only that he was not the kind of person who typically appeared at a gallery freight intake window at 9:40 in the morning, and that his suit was the color of cooled ash, and that he asked for the Santos consignment with the specific patience of someone who had never once needed to ask twice for anything in his life. She looked at her screen. She found the log entry. She told him the crate had been returned to the originating freight account 6 days ago, that she had a delivery confirmation, and that she could provide a copy of the outgoing documentation if he needed it for his records. Dimi looked at her for a moment. She felt in her collarbone. "I'll need that copy," he said, "and nothing else." She printed it. He took it. He left without touching anything on her desk, and Nora sat for a long count of 4 before she realized her hands were completely still, which was not their usual condition when strangers appeared unexpectedly in the intake room. She did not think about it again until the painting came back. It arrived in a new crate, different freight carrier, 14 days after Dimi's visit, addressed to Nora personally at the gallery street address. Not to the intake department, not to the gallery director. To Nora Vasquez, spelled correctly, with a diacritical mark over the second vowel that strangers never bothered with. She stood at the freight table and looked at the label for a long moment before she opened the crate. The painting inside was oil on linen, small, maybe 20 by 16 inches. A harbor scene rendered in the low, warm light of very early morning. The water had been done with patience, the kind that required someone to have sat and watched actual water for a long time before attempting to describe it in paint. She had been an intake clerk for 4 years, had logged hundreds of pieces moving in and out of this building, and she could say with some confidence that this was not the most valuable thing she had ever handled. She could also say that whoever painted it had been thinking of a specific place and a specific time of day, and had not been willing to approximate either. She found the note folded inside the crate's padding, sealed in a plain white envelope with no markings. She opened it. 6 words, handwritten in dark ink, a slant that pressed slightly harder on the downstroke. She read them once, looked up at the far wall of the intake room, and read them again. She did not put them down. She put them in her coat pocket. The gallery where Nora worked occupied the first 3 floors of a converted textile building in the old industrial quarter of the city, a neighborhood that had been in the process of becoming something else for the past decade without ever quite arriving. The building still had its original freight elevators and its original concrete floors, which the gallery had sealed and polished but not replaced. And the light came in through windows that were 3 times too large for the rooms, which was the gallery's only reliable aesthetic. Nora had taken the intake job 4 years ago because it paid $31,000 a year, offered access to more art than she could ever afford to own, and required her to talk to considerably fewer people than the front desk position she'd originally applied for. She was good at the intake work. She was meticulous with provenance, careful with condition reports, and had twice flagged pieces for authentication review that turned out to matter significantly to their owners' insurance carriers. She had not been formally recognized for either catch. Cale had filed the reports under his own name, Cale Marsh had managed the gallery's private sales and consignment division for 6 years and carried himself with the specific confidence of a man who had never had his instincts seriously questioned by anyone with the authority to question them. He was 43, well-dressed in a deliberate way, and had a habit of standing in doorways when he wanted something from her rather than sitting down. He had been her direct supervisor for all 4 years she'd worked there. When he appeared in the intake room that afternoon, she had the painting recrated and was preparing the return paperwork. "What is that?" he said from the doorway. She explained it. The expired consignment, the return, the redelivery, the note, though she did not describe its contents. She said she was planning to return it in person, since whoever had sent it had taken the trouble to address it to her by name, with the diacritical correct. Cale stepped into the room. He looked at the crate. He looked at the address label. His expression did not change in any visible way, but the quality of the room changed, which was the kind of thing Nora's body registered before her mind had finished processing. She had spent a long time in rooms with men whose stillness preceded unpleasant things, and she knew the difference between comfortable stillness and the other kind. "Santos," he said, reading the freight account number. "That's Edward Santos's storage account." She did not say anything. "You sent back a piece from Edward Santos's private custody account," Cale said, without clearing it with me first. "It was expired," she said. "The protocol is clear on expired consignments. You were CC'd. I'm your supervisor." He picked up the outgoing documentation she'd left on the table and looked at it. "You don't return a piece from that account without talking to me first. Do you understand what I'm telling you?" She did. She understood that Cale had some arrangement with this account that was not documented in the gallery system, and that she had disrupted it without knowing it existed, and that he was now trying to decide how far he could push the disruption back onto her. She had seen this particular calculation on his face before, applied to smaller things. She said, "I followed the protocol." "I don't care about the protocol." He set the documentation down. "You go nowhere near this piece again. You file no further correspondence with the Santos account. You say nothing to anyone on the intake staff about this consignment. If you do any of those things, I will make sure the gallery director understands that you've been mishandling private consignments. Your intake certifications don't transfer. You know that. You leave here with nothing." She knew exactly what was in her employment file. She also knew that what he was describing would cost her the only position in this city that paid her enough to cover the rent on her apartment and her half of her sister's utilities. Greta had been on modified work hours since her injury in February, and Nora's $31,000 was currently doing the work of considerably more. She looked at Cale. She said nothing. He took her silence for compliance, because it suited him to, and left. She put the return documentation in the bottom drawer of the intake desk, locked it, and called Greta from the freight elevator. Greta picked up on the second ring, which meant she was at home and not in any immediate distress. And Nora listened to her sister's voice for about 30 seconds before saying she would stop by Thursday with groceries. She did not mention Cale. She did not mention the note. She rode the freight elevator back to the 3rd floor and spent the rest of the afternoon logging a shipment of lithographic prints from a collector in the north part of the city. And she did not look at the crate in the corner, and her hands were not still. If you've ever watched someone figure out exactly how much they can be made to bear, this is where you'd look away. She returned the painting in person on a Wednesday. She told no one at the gallery where she was going. She carried the crate in a padded transport bag, which was correct gallery procedure for a single small canvas. And she took the bus across the river to the address she'd found in the expired consignment file. an address associated with a building management company whose registered office was in a glass and steel tower 16 blocks north of the gallery. The lobby had black marble floors and a desk attended by two men who were not receptionists in any ordinary sense. One of them made a call. She waited. A third man came down in the elevator and introduced himself as Dimi. She recognized his suit. He recognized her immediately as well, though his expression gave nothing away except a faint recalibration, a slight additional care applied to his already careful manner. He thanked her for coming. He asked if she would like to wait upstairs while he arranged for the piece to be stored properly. She said she would prefer to complete the transfer here in the lobby and get a signature. Dimi looked at her. "Mr. Santos would like to speak with you." She had prepared for this possibility. She had decided on the bus that if it arose, she would decline politely and leave the painting with a signed transfer document. She had the form in her bag. What she had not prepared for was the quality of the quiet in that lobby. The way the two men at the desk were giving her a wide, considerate berth. The way Dimi was standing at a distance that communicated something she could not quite classify. She said she would go up for a few minutes. Eduard Santos was standing at the far end of a room that was not his office, or at least did not read as one. It had books on two walls and a window that looked north over the river. And the furniture was the kind that had been used rather than displayed. He was in a white shirt with no jacket, and he was perhaps 40. And the thing she noticed first about him was not his face, but the way the room organized itself around where he was standing. Not because he was performing anything. Simply because that was the room's natural geometry when he was in it. He said, "Thank you for bringing it back." His voice was level, not quiet in a performed way, not the cultivated softness of someone who had learned to weaponize calm. Simply level, the way a room is level when nothing in it is tilted. She said, "I brought the transfer form. I'd like a signature for the gallery's records." He looked at her for a moment. Something brief crossed his expression, and she could not name it. He said, "Of course," and came to the table where she had set the bag down. He signed. She checked the form. She said the piece was in good condition, that she had found no evidence of transit damage, that the linen support appeared stable. She said this the way she would say it to any client, with specificity and without embellishment. And when she finished, he was looking at her with an attention she felt in her sternum. "The note," he said. "I read it," she said. He did not ask her what she had done with it. She did not tell him it was still in her coat pocket, that she had not yet taken it out at home because she had the sense that once she put it somewhere, it would become a different kind of thing than it currently was. She did not tell him she had read it 9 times. She put the transfer form in her bag and said she needed to get back. He said, "Someone has been making your position at the gallery difficult." She went still, not the performed kind of stillness, the involuntary kind. "I would like to address that," he said, "if you'll permit it." She stood at the table in his north-facing room with the river light coming in behind him, and thought about the bottom drawer of the intake desk and Greta's modified hours, and the way Cale had picked up the outgoing documentation with 2 fingers, as if it were something she had done wrong that he was being generous enough to handle for her. She thought about the last 4 years of correctly filed reports and correctly flagged authentications and the $31,000 a year that was exactly enough and no more. She said, "I don't know what that would look like." He said, "It would look like the end of a problem." 3 days later, Cale Marsh was called into a meeting with the gallery director and 2 members of the gallery's board. The meeting lasted 40 minutes. When he came out, His access badge was deactivated, and a facilities staff member was waiting to walk him to his desk so he could remove his personal items. By the end of the business day, the gallery's director had sent a formal notice to the intake department, acknowledging the correct handling of the Santos consignment and placing a positive note in Nora's personnel file. She learned about Cale's departure from her colleague Marcus, who had watched the whole sequence from the hallway and reported it to her in the kitchen with the same tone of barely contained satisfaction that Nora felt, but did not allow herself to show. She sat with the knowledge for most of that evening. She sat with it the way you sit with a thing that is unmistakably good, and that came from somewhere you are not entirely comfortable with. She ate leftovers and called Greta, who complained amiably about physical therapy and asked if Nora was sleeping. And Nora said yes, because the alternative was a longer conversation than she had capacity for. She hung up and looked at the note, which she had finally taken out of her coat pocket and left on the kitchen table. 6 words. She had been thinking about them for 2 weeks. The painting he had written was my mother's, and you treated it well. She understood, sitting at that kitchen table, that she had done something for this man without knowing she was doing it, and that it had mattered to him in a way she was only beginning to map. She also understood that he had removed a genuine obstacle from her professional life with the kind of efficiency that suggested Cale's departure was not the most consequential thing Edward Santos had managed this week. Possibly not this morning. This is the moment the story turns. And if you've been watching closely, you already know why. After that, things changed in the way that deniable things change, incrementally, and without anyone officially announcing them. A car appeared outside the gallery on the evening she worked late, a dark sedan with a driver who did not introduce himself, which she pretended not to notice for exactly 4 days before she stopped pretending. A package arrived at her desk with no note, containing a sealed container of food from a restaurant she had mentioned to Dimmy in passing as being her favorite. When he had asked with his careful procedural politeness whether she had any dietary restrictions for a meeting, he said Mr. Santos wished to schedule. She had said she didn't, and then mentioned the restaurant, and the food had appeared 2 days later. She ate it at her desk. It was very good. She did not mention the car or the food to anyone at the gallery. Dimmy appeared in the intake room 3 times over the following 2 weeks on minor logistical matters, each time with the same measured courtesy. And she noticed that he treated her questions as worth answering carefully and her requests as worth executing promptly. She was not accustomed to being treated that way by people who reported to men with money. She filed the observation without comment. The meetings with Edward happened twice more before the midpoint. Short, in the north-facing room, with the river visible and the furniture used-looking and his voice level. She told him about the authentication flag she'd filed the previous spring, the one Cale had taken credit for. He listened. He did not perform outrage. He asked which auction house had handled the piece, what the insurance differential had been, whether the original owner had been notified. She answered each question. He had the manner of someone who gathered information because he genuinely intended to use it, not because it was expected of him. She found this more disorienting than most things about the situation. On the 3rd visit, he showed her the painting. It was hung in a small room off the main corridor, alone on an ivory-colored wall, lit from above by a fixture that had been placed to catch the particular warm tone of the harbor water. He did not say anything when she looked at it. She stood in front of it for a long time, and she thought about whoever had painted this and what they had been trying to keep. And she understood that what she had logged correctly and returned correctly and brought back across the river in a padded transport bag was not simply $400,000 worth of oil on linen. It was a harbor someone's mother had looked at. It was a time of day she had loved. "She died 8 years ago," Edward said from the doorway. And his voice was the same as always, except in a single short clause, a fraction of a change in register that she did not examine while he was in the room. "The painting was the last thing she acquired. I moved it here when I sold the house." Nora looked at the water in the painting. She said, "The painter knew exactly where the light came from." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "She used to say the same thing." She turned then and found him looking at the painting from the doorway. And there was nothing in his face that was performed or managed, just a man in a room where something of his mother's hung on the wall. And she understood that she was seeing something he had not shown anyone else in that building, and possibly not in some years. She did not say anything else. She stood beside him, and they looked at the painting and the harbor light held in the water. And she put her hands in her coat pockets, where the original note was still folded in the left one, and she did not take it out. She told Greta that evening. Not everything, not the north-facing room or the painting, but enough. Greta was a practical woman who had spent 20 years watching Nora navigate things alone that she should have had help with. And her response was measured skepticism with a warm undertone that Nora recognized as her sister's version of worry. "Who is he?" Greta said. "Someone who had a piece in the gallery's storage." "Nora, he's serious," Nora said. Which was not quite the same as answering the question, but it was what she had. Greta said, "I know serious. Serious and safe are not the same thing." "I know," Nora said. She did know. She also knew that the car outside was still there, and that Cale had not come back, and that the painting of the harbor was hanging in exactly the right light in a room off the main corridor, and that she had put it there, in a way, without knowing she was doing it. Edward's phone appeared on her desk the following Tuesday. Dimmy placed it there with his usual care and said, "Mr. Santos asks that you keep this with you. It is registered to a secure line. If you press the emergency contact, it goes to me directly." He paused. "He asks that you not read too much into it." She looked at the phone. It was a plain dark handset, nothing conspicuous. She said, "How long has he been worried?" Dimmy looked at her with the same slight recalibration she had seen in the lobby 2 weeks ago. "Since about 15 minutes after you left the transfer form," he said, and said nothing else. She put the phone in her bag. The parking structure beneath the gallery was 3 levels underground and had been built in an era when parking structures were designed for function rather than safety, which meant that the lights on the lower 2 levels worked unreliably, and the elevator had a 3-second delay that anyone who used it regularly learned to compensate for. Nora parked on the first level when she could. On the evening Victor Wren's men found her, she could not, because a visiting installation had taken the first level's accessible spaces, and she had parked on 2. She had heard the name Wren twice in passing, once in an overheard phone conversation between Dimmy and someone she hadn't seen, and once from Edward himself, who had mentioned it briefly in the context of a business matter with the specific brevity he used when a subject was closed. She had filed it, as she filed most things, without making it smaller than it was. 2 men she did not recognize came from behind a concrete pillar as she was walking toward the elevator. One of them said her name and used it the way people use names when they want to establish that they already know things about you. The elevator doors were 20 feet ahead of her. There was no one else on that level. She did not freeze. She had been on the wrong end of enclosed spaces before, and her body had a protocol that had nothing to do with what her mind was doing. She calculated the elevator, the stairwell door to her left, the distance to both. She put her hand in her bag. She did not get to the phone. The second man was already at her right side, and his hand was on her arm, and she was walked back toward a vehicle she had not seen from the elevator side of the pillar, a dark four-door that had been backed in against the wall. The man on her right pushed her into the rear passenger seat and got in beside her. The first man drove. They did not cover her head. She took that as information. She looked at the level's concrete wall through the window as the car moved toward the exit ramp. She counted her breath. She thought about Greta's physical therapy appointments and the light in the harbor painting and the fact that she was not going to get out of this car in a way that let these men stay in control of the next 24 hours. She thought about the phone in her bag. Her elbow was against the door. She was not restrained. The man beside her was looking at the driver, not at her. She waited through 2 turns on the exit ramp, felt the car slow for the barrier arm, watched the driver reach out the window for the ticket, and drove her left elbow into the window glass. She had aimed for the edge of the frame because that is where glass is structurally weakest, and she had aimed wrong by 2 inches, which is why she hit the side mirror housing instead of the window. The mirror housing cracked and came half off the mount. The driver swore. The man beside her grabbed for her arm, and she was already into her bag. 2 fingers, the phone, and she pressed the emergency contact and held it. The man beside her took the phone. She had held it for 11 seconds. She had counted. She did not know if that was long enough. They drove for 23 minutes. She tracked it on the dashboard clock. They brought her to a warehouse in the Port District, a building that smelled of old diesel and insulated foam, and sat her in a chair in an interior room with a concrete floor and fluorescent lights that hummed at a frequency she felt behind her molars. Victor Wren came in after perhaps 15 minutes. He was a man in his 50s, well-dressed after the fashion of someone who understood that clothing was a tool, with a considered professional calm that he wore the way her intake room's more manipulative clients wore patience. He told her she was not going to be harmed. He told her this was a business matter, and that she was going to help resolve it by sitting exactly where she was until Edward Santos agreed to discuss certain territorial arrangements that had been pending for some months. He said Edward would come quickly, given the circumstances. He said, "You must be something unusual to him. He is not usually this exposed." She looked at him and said nothing. She had 11 seconds. She kept thinking about the 11 seconds, whether the signal had registered, whether Dimmy had heard it. She looked at the fluorescent light above her and thought about Greta's skepticism, which she now understood had been entirely correct, and which she intended to tell her sister directly, at the first available opportunity. She did not wait passively. She counted the people in the building. She estimated the distance to the door. She asked for water. Not because she needed it, but because the man who brought it left the door open for 4 seconds on both the entrance and the exit, and she needed to know if there was a second guard in the corridor. There was not. She filed this. Her hands were cold and her breathing was controlled, and the fluorescent light hummed, and she waited. Edward arrived in 51 minutes. She knew it was him before anyone opened the door because of what she heard in the corridor, which was not shouting and was not the particular sound of a building being taken apart dramatically from the outside. It was something more deliberate than that. A sequence of movements, and then a specific quality of quiet that accumulated in a way she recognized. A few minutes ago, it was a building full of Wren's people. And then, incrementally, it was not. The door opened. Dimmy was first through. He looked at her with the careful attention she was familiar with and said, "Are you hurt?" She said, "No." She stood. Her knees were reliable, which she noted. Edward came through the door and looked at her from across the room, and she saw exactly what Greta had told her was in serious men. and what she had agreed was not the same as safe. And she saw also the version of him that existed when his containment was very close to its outer edge. His jaw was set. His hands were at his sides. He did not speak. He crossed the room, and she watched him come. And when he was close enough, he put his hand on the side of her face, her right cheek, briefly, carefully, and she understood that this was a man who had been deciding whether she was alive for 51 minutes, and that this was the only version of relief he was going to allow himself in this room. He said, "We are leaving." She said, "I broke his mirror." He looked at her. Something shifted in the quality of his attention. A fraction of warmth, the particular warmth of someone who has just been given a piece of information that surprised them and that they intend to keep. He said, "I know." Demi picked up the signal. Victor Wren was in the corridor when they came out. He was standing with two of Edward's men behind him and had the look of a man who had correctly identified where his miscalculation was, but had not yet arrived at what to do about it. He looked at Nora with a recalibrated assessment, the kind that arrives too late to be useful. Edward said, "Victor?" and nothing else for a long moment. Then, in a voice that had not changed in volume or pace from anything else she had heard him say, he laid out a precise, item-by-item accounting of what was going to happen to Wren's operation in the next 72 hours, which was nothing dramatic and nothing performative. Just a set of specific logistical facts that were already in motion, delivered the way a doctor delivers a prognosis for which the outcome is not in question. He named the accounts. He named the Port Authority contacts. He named the 3 faction heads who had already confirmed they would not be doing further business with Wren's network. He said this in front of Wren's own remaining men, who were the actual audience. And Nora watched their faces and saw the moment the calculation changed for all of them. Then he said, in the same voice, "You put your hand on someone who is mine." The word landed in the fluorescent-lit corridor with the weight of a thing that had always been true, and was only now being said in a room with witnesses. Wren's face did not change, and also changed entirely. He said nothing. Edward said, "You will not do business in this city again." He turned and walked Nora to the exit. His hand was at the small of her back, not gripping, not directing, simply present. Behind them, she heard Demi giving quiet, specific instructions to the men in the corridor. She heard Wren's voice begin a sentence and stop. Outside, the night air was cool and the port smelled of salt water and diesel, and somewhere above the warehouse line, a ship's horn sounded twice. There was a car at the curb, Demi's sedan, and the driver already had the rear door open. She got in. Edward got in beside her. For a moment they were both quiet. She said, "I was going to get to the phone myself." He said, "I know." She said, "I want you to know that." He looked at her in the dark interior of the car, and his voice when he spoke was not the level professional voice, and also not the version of him at the edge of his containment. It was something in between, quieter, more carefully placed. He said, "I have known that since you came across the river with the transfer form and asked for a signature." She looked at the port lights going by through the window. She said, "The note." He waited. She said, "The 6 words." He said, "Yes." She took the folded envelope from her coat pocket, where it had been since the first Tuesday, and she looked at it in the dark of the car and did not open it because she did not need to. She already knew every word. She put it back. She called Greta from the car, and Greta picked up on the first ring, which meant she was awake and had been waiting. And Nora said she was all right and was coming over. And Greta said nothing for 3 seconds and then said she had made soup and left it on the stove. Nora hung up and looked out at the river as the sedan crossed the bridge. The following morning, Dimi arrived at the gallery before it opened. He came to the intake room, where Nora had already unlocked the freight bay and was reviewing the overnight log, and he spoke to the gallery director in Nora's presence. He thanked the director for the gallery's continued cooperation with Mr. Santos's storage account. He mentioned that the gallery's private custody services had been highly recommended to several additional clients whose collections would require precisely the caliber of care that Ms. Vasquez had demonstrated in the handling of the Santos consignment. He mentioned this the way he mentioned most things, with procedural courtesy and no visible drama. But the gallery director's attention sharpened in a way that was visible, and that Nora filed without expression. By the end of the week, the gallery's intake department had been restructured slightly, with Nora's position reclassified and her salary revised to $42,000 annually, a correction the director described as reflecting the role's actual responsibilities. Marcus, who had been in the hallway the day Cale left and who had since become the most reliable source of institutional information in the building, told her that 3 new storage clients with significant collections had submitted intake paperwork that specifically named her as their preferred contact. She looked at the paperwork and recognized none of the names. She recognized the handwriting on the cover letter of one of them. She did not mention this to Marcus. Greta came to the gallery the following Saturday, which was the first time she had been to the building in 2 years. She arrived on the bus with her cane and her specific, unconvinced expression, and Nora gave her the tour with the patience she reserved for people she loved who were in the process of updating a long-held assessment. She showed Greta the intake room. She showed her the freight elevator. She showed her the harbor painting in the small room off the corridor, and she watched Greta stand in front of it for a longer time than Greta usually stood in front of anything. "The water is right," Greta said. "I know." Greta turned and looked at her. The skepticism was there, but underneath it was the warmer thing. The thing that had always been underneath Greta's skepticism when it was directed at Nora specifically. She said, "You're not afraid." "I know what I'm walking into," Nora said. "That's different from not afraid." Greta looked at her for a long moment and then nodded once, which was Greta's version of a verdict, and did not say anything else on the subject. Edward came to the gallery that afternoon, which was not something he had done before. He came without Dimi, which she noticed. He came through the main entrance rather than the freight side, and the man at the front desk said his name when he came through the door, said Mr. Santos, without being told or consulting any list, and Edward moved through the lobby with the unhurried deliberateness that was the only pace she had ever seen him use. He found her in the intake room. He stood in the doorway, which was where Cale had once stood to tell her what she was not allowed to do. And the doorway now was simply a doorway, because the person standing in it was a different person entirely. He said, "Dimi tells me you've already reviewed the new client intake forms." She said, "I did." He said, "And?" She said, "The provenance documentation on the 3rd one is incomplete. I sent a correction request this morning." He looked at her. The warmth that had been in his expression in the car after the port came back now, quieter and more settled than it had been in the dark, the kind that stays rather than visits. He said, "I'll have it corrected." She said, "I know you will." Behind her, through the intake room's open door that gave onto the freight bay, she heard the building's ordinary sounds. The freight elevator's cable, Marcus's voice on the phone down the corridor, the specific hum of the ventilation system that had needed adjustment since February. She had learned all of it the way you learn the sounds of a place you have decided to stay in. And she stood in the middle of it with Edward Santos in the doorway, and the note still in her coat pocket, and the painting of the harbor hanging in its correct light down the hall. He asked if she wanted to get dinner with Greta. He said it without preface, the way he said most things, with the authority of a man who had already decided what would happen and was giving her the opportunity to arrange it on her own terms. She considered telling him that was not precisely how invitations worked. She decided she would tell him some other time. She said yes. They walked out through the main entrance, all three of them, Greta with her cane on the marble floor that caught the late afternoon light. And the man at the front desk looked up and said, "Good evening, Miss Vasquez," without consulting anyone. He had not been told her name. He already knew it.